On the night of January 13, 2012, one of the largest cruise ships in the Mediterranean turned, in a matter of minutes, into one of the worst maritime disasters in modern European history. The Costa Concordia, carrying more than 4,000 people between passengers and crew, was sailing close to the island of Giglio, off the coast of Tuscany, when it deviated from its planned route to pass nearer to shore. It was a maneuver the crew had performed before, almost a tradition, meant to salute the island's residents by lighting up the coastline with the ship's own glow. But that night, the hull struck the submerged rocks known as Lascaux at a speed of roughly 16 knots, and the result was catastrophic. A gash more than 170 feet long tore open along the hull, cutting through 5 watertight compartments. For a ship engineered to survive with only 2 compartments flooded, that kind of damage was, quite simply, a death sentence. The ship began listing almost immediately, losing power, going dark. The evacuation, which should have started right away, was delayed for over an hour, caught up in confused and contradictory communication between the captain, the crew, and coastal authorities on shore. Thousands of passengers had to abandon a ship that was already partially capsized, boarding lifeboats at a dangerous angle as the hull slowly settled onto a rocky shelf near the coast of Giglio. By the end of that night, 32 people had lost their lives. The body of the last missing victim, an Indian waiter named Russell Rebello, would only be recovered nearly 3 years later, in November 2014, during the salvage operation itself. The Costa Concordia was left lying on its side, half submerged, right beside a small island inside the largest protected marine sanctuary in Europe, the Pelagos Sanctuary for Mediterranean marine mammals. And it was precisely that location that turned a human tragedy into one of the most complex engineering operations ever attempted anywhere in the world. The ship weighed 114,000 tons and stretched nearly 950 feet from bow to stern, longer than the Eiffel Tower is tall if you laid it on its side. It was resting precariously on 2 underwater rock pinnacles that, at any moment, could puncture the hull further or let the ship slide off into deeper water where recovery would have been all but impossible. Simply blowing the wreck apart where it lay, the way you might deal with an unrecoverable wreck elsewhere, was never an option. That would have spilled thousands of tons of fuel, oil, and debris into a protected marine reserve, home to dolphins and whales just a few miles away. The only real option was, somehow, to lift the entire ship back onto its feet, in one piece, and carry it away intact. Before anyone could even think about moving that much steel, the most urgent danger had to be dealt with, the fuel still sitting in the ship's tanks. Throughout the early months of 2012, dive teams worked in brutal conditions, in freezing water with almost no visibility, to locate and tap into the Concordia's fuel tanks and pump out more than 2,000 tons of heavy oil. Only once that phase was complete, by March of 2012, could engineers even begin drafting a real plan to move the hull itself. In April 2012, the contract to remove the Concordia was awarded to a joint venture between the American firm Titan Salvage and the Italian company Mico Peri. The plan they proposed sounded, at first glance, almost like science fiction. It was called parbuckling, an old nautical term for rotating a heavy object around its own axis using cables and counterweights, not unlike rolling up a heavy carpet until it stands itself upright. To make that possible with a ship weighing over 100,000 tons, engineers first had to build an entire artificial seabed underwater, strong enough to support all that weight once the hull finally settled into an upright position. Throughout 2012 and into early 2013, divers and engineers constructed, on the sea floor beside the island, a support platform built from steel piles driven into the rock and specially engineered grout bags, creating a level artificial bed ready to receive the ship once it had been rotated into place. At the same time, along the exposed side of the hull, crews began welding on enormous hollow steel tanks called sponsons, essentially giant flotation chambers the size of multi-story buildings. Once filled with water, these tanks would act as counterweights, helping to pull the ship toward vertical during the rotation. On the opposite side, the side that had been underwater and resting against the rocks, more sponsons were installed as well, though these would only come into play later in the next stage of the operation. The rotation itself depended on a massive system of steel cables, hydraulic pulleys, and machines called strand jacks, hydraulic winches capable of pulling cables with tremendous, precisely synchronized force. In total, more than 500 workers and engineers, drawn from over 24 countries, spent well over a year preparing every detail of this phase, fully aware there was no room for error. There was no plan B. If the hull had cracked apart during the rotation, or slipped off the rock pinnacles into deeper water, the entire recovery would have become essentially impossible, and the environmental fallout would have been catastrophic. In the early hours of September 16, 2013, after an overnight storm delayed the start by roughly 3 hours, the operation finally began. Slowly, almost imperceptibly to the millions watching live on television, the hull started to rotate around the axis formed by the steel platform built into the seabed below. The cables tightened, the sponsons filled with water at precisely calculated moments, and the 950-foot structure inched, degree by degree, from lying on its side to standing upright. The operation, originally expected to take 10 to 12 hours, ended up stretching to roughly 19 hours, far slower and more delicate than planned, because every single movement had to be carefully monitored and verified before the next one could begin. Shortly after 4 in the morning on September 17th, a foghorn sounded off the coast of Giglio. The head of Italy's Civil Protection Agency announced that the ship had reached a fully vertical position. The Costa Concordia was standing upright again for the first time in 20 months, resting on the artificial platform built specifically to receive it. Nick Sloan, the South African salvage master who led the operation for the Titan Mycoperi Consortium, would later describe the result as close to perfect, with no fuel spill and no significant pollution detected throughout the entire process. But righting the ship was only half the battle. After 20 months underwater, resting unevenly against sharp rock, the side of the hull that had been submerged had suffered serious structural damage, and it needed to be reinforced and stabilized before anyone could even think about refloating the vessel. Through the following autumn and winter, engineering teams worked to prepare the hull to withstand rougher seas during the year's stormiest months, and only in the spring of 2014 were the remaining flotation tanks installed on the side that had previously been submerged, completing the set that had already gone up on the opposite side during the rotation phase. In July 2014, the refloating phase finally began, the process of getting the Concordia to float freely once again. With flotation tanks now installed on both sides of the hull, filled and emptied with extraordinary precision, the ship was slowly lifted off the artificial seabed, where it had rested for nearly a year, until it floated on its own for the first time since the night of the accident. From there, a fleet of 14 vessels, led by the tugboat Blizzard, prepared to escort the hull on its final journey. On July 22, 2014, the Costa Concordia began its tow across roughly 195 miles of open sea, a slow and carefully calculated journey, rarely exceeding 2 knots, toward the port of Genoa, the very city where the ship had first been delivered to Costa Crociere 7 years before the disaster. The voyage ended on July 27, 2014, when the hull, partially disfigured and coated in 20 months of accumulated marine growth, finally entered the port where it would be dismantled for good. The dismantling process in Genoa would end up taking even longer than the salvage operation at sea. Before the ship could be cut apart and recycled as scrap steel, crews had to strip out everything that wasn't metal: furniture, wiring, insulation, plastics, and above all, conduct one final, meticulous search for any remaining human remains. Only after that painstaking phase could workers begin cutting through the hull section by section for steel recycling. The complete dismantling of what remained of the Costa Concordia was finished in July 2017, more than 5.5 years after the night the ship struck the rocks off Giglio. All told, factoring in the emergency response, the salvage operation itself, the tow to Genoa, and the final scrapping, the combined cost of the disaster topped $2 billion, more than 3 times what it had cost to build the ship in the first place, just a few years earlier. The righting operation alone, the parbuckling phase, is estimated to have cost several $100 million, making it the most expensive marine salvage operation in history at the time. Today, the site where the Costa Concordia once lay wrecked shows almost no visible trace of the disaster. After the ship was removed, dive and engineering teams spent several more years dismantling the artificial platform built on the seabed and restoring the surrounding marine environment as closely as possible to its original state, a cleanup effort that wasn't officially completed until 2018. The story of the Costa Concordia is usually remembered for the tragedy of that January night and for the trial of its captain, who was sentenced to 16 years in prison for manslaughter, causing the shipwreck, and abandoning ship before all passengers had gotten off. But the operation that followed, stretching across more than 2.5 years, stands as one of the most remarkable feats of maritime engineering in modern history, proof of what patience, millimeter precision, and a plan built to leave zero room for error can accomplish. A ship of more than 100,000 tons, grounded on rocks inside a protected nature reserve, was righted, stabilized, refloated, and towed intact across hundreds of miles of open sea, without triggering the environmental catastrophe so many had feared. And maybe that's the real lesson buried inside the Concordia's story. That even something that looks physically impossible can, more often than not, be solved not with speed, but with the right amount of time, the right team, and the right engineering.